Yeah. Okay, guys, I have a very, legit, I swear, talk on scalability, but I thought we could all use a break from it. So I would like to start you all off with a synchronized clap. Are y'all ready to clap with me? There we go. We did it. Thank you all. Woo! All right, what's going on, y'all? I am Ben, and I am from a company called Optimism. Thank you. And I am here today to talk about Rollups. It's the thing we're doing, optimistic Rollups. And I hope you guys know Portal, or this slide won't make much sense. But it's been a while, y'all. It really has. It has been 2.5 years since we kind of had Rollups coming onto the scene. Most of that's been during COVID. We personally have been live on mainnet for over a year now. And so it's time to talk about that. There's a lot of things that we got to say, and it's been a while. We've been in hiding, we've been in quarantine, and we got to get it all out there. So I'm going to talk about sort of 3 things. I'm going to go over what's happened, where we're at so far. I'm going to talk about what we see coming up in Rollups in the next, say year, in the reasonable short term with a lot of clarity. And then we're going to try to make some projections about where all this stuff is headed. Sound good? Yeah. Okay, so what has happened? Okay, I'll start with the shills. Guys, we are almost at $1 billion saved on Optimism mainnet. Woo! Very exciting. So if everyone did all their transactions that they've done on Optimism on L1, they would have spent almost $1 billion more. So we're pretty hype about that. If you guys haven't tried out our system, go check it out. Okay, so that's the shill part. I also want to talk about some of the mistakes we made. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we made, I think the biggest, was we undervalued the EVM semantics. What does that mean? Okay, well, obviously to build these roll-up things, we need to have a way to secure the system. And we do that with this optimistic roll-up design. It involves disputes, some fancy stuff behind the scenes. The point is, we came out with the first version of this that was called the OVM, the Optimistic Virtual Machine. And this was great, but you'll notice that O is different than E. And at first we thought that was fine, but it turned out, as we kept going, this wasn't quite the case. Sure, you could take a Solidity contract or a Viper contract and get it running on our system. But the reality was that the more we dug in and the more people started trying, the more we realized that the small, itty-bitty nuances of the EVM really mattered. In fact, all of that tooling doesn't integrate it with Solidity. It integrates with the EVM itself, the instructions, the bytecode, all of this wonderful technical jargon, right? And this meant a lot of tooling broke. It also meant that sometimes you couldn't just deploy your contract. You had to figure out what the difference in the OVM might be and fix that difference and get it to deploy. So these are challenges. One thing I think we did do right is we got Geth running. We've been running Geth in prod for over a year now. And the reality is, for these rollups to succeed, we need to build on the very strong foundation that the Go Ethereum codebase gives us. So that's something that we were doing right, but there were a lot we were doing wrong there. So if you haven't tried deploying on Optimism in the last 6 months, you should try now, because it got way easier. We did the EVM equivalence upgrade, right? So this is a wonderful, Ethereum yellow paper that we perfectly conform with every little nitty-gritty detail of how the instructions and how your Ethereum works on Rollup. So that got us the tooling, that got us effortless deployments, and that got us even closer to Geth. The reality is we were running Geth, but we had to have some differences. Now those differences are tiny, tiny. And that is really good news, because it means we're building on the strong core foundation that Ethereum gives us. Okay, so what are some of the other things that's happened outside of Optimism? One thing is that bridges have become a reality. Raise your hand if you've used a bridge. Okay, not bad, not bad. So, like 3 years ago, this is my co-founder Kelvin, 4 years ago now, my God, writing about fast withdrawals, talking about the idea that we can move money between these different chains seamlessly and quickly. And that has gone from concept to reality. This is from our webpage. There's a bunch of bridges that you can use to move around. And that's a big deal. It's really cool. However, it is notable that the two largest hacks, not just in crypto, but in the history of the universe, as you know, humanity, I suppose, I don't know about the aliens, the two biggest hacks were bridge hacks. And we can't avoid this with optimistic rollups. That's the point, is to give us increased security to avoid it. But not all bridges do. So I think that's an interesting thing, and it's worth discussing. And ultimately, I do think that's okay, because the reality is you get a choice. If you want a cheaper bridge that is under-collateralized and has some risk to it, you can use that. If you want to pay a bit more and guarantee your money is safe, you can too. And I think that having that choice, even though it may be scary, is a fundamental thing that we do in crypto. We want to give users choice. And if you want to make that risky bet, you can. Okay, another thing that's happened is we've had an explosion of MEV. So 2 years ago, we put out this idea that you should sequence rollups. You should have the people producing the blocks of the rollups be independent from the people that are mining the L1 blocks. Now we have a majority of L2s following this scheme. And we have also seen an explosion of MEV on L1. An absolute explosion, right? When we wrote this, very small. Now, Flashbots, everything else, it's millions of dollars. It's a huge, huge gain, right? And what we're starting to see, this is an awesome paper I'd highly recommend by the Flashbots team. We're starting to see the dawn of cross-chain MEV. We're starting to realize that just like you can do arbitrage on one chain, you can buy one asset on one chain and sell it on another and make arbitrage. And there's really interesting properties that are coming out of that, so it's fascinating. There is a lot more going on with MEV, and it is a long road ahead, but it is very, very, very interesting, and it's definitely been very active in the past 2 years. Okay, the last thing that we've seen is we have seen this cycles EOS. We have seen Solana, the big blockchains. And I think this is a really interesting one for the audience and for the people who are here at ETH Denver, because the reality is, okay, this is a ridiculous slide. It's definitely self-deprecating because I am firmly in Ethereum, but I think the reality is there are big blockchains outside that are trying to scale Ethereum differently, and while they may not align with the values that are very, very important to us and to our community, there are legitimate advantages that these systems afford. Namely, they have much better composability because everything is on one chain. It means you can do your cross-chain call, your cross-contract calls synchronously. And the reality is that is what we should be comparing what we're building with Ethereum L2s to. It's simply not realistic to say that values are enough. We have to provide the technology. And we can do this. It's harder because we want to secure things with L1, but it is possible. We can compete, even if we have tighter constraints. And in general, I think there's a multi-chain versus mono-chain narrative right now, which is kind of what all this is about. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Namely, it is a false dichotomy, IMO. You can have both. And the last thing that we have is that the rollup-centric Ethereum is going strong. So 2 years ago, V put out this post about the rollup-centric Ethereum roadmap. Today, we have literally dozens of L2s. Shout out L2beat.com. You can go look at them all, learn about them. Fantastic stuff. The ecosystem is exploding. And that's really exciting. It's the Ethereum vision coming alive. Okay, with that being said, some things have been lost. I would say that if I were to look 3 years back, when Ethereum scaling was much more focused on ETH2 Phase 2 sharded execution, the talk of the town was how are we going to solve the composability problem? And since we've started saying that rollups are going to be an ecosystem that are all settled on L1, that's a great vision, but I do think we've lost some of that. So I pulled some of these screenshots from a while back that are people talking about cross-shard composability. And some of that has been lost in the current system. Okay, woo! So that is what's been going on in the past 2 years. What is coming up in the short term? Okay, the big thing for us is Optimism Bedrock Edition. Just a little bit more shilling here. This is our ground-up EVM equivalence roll-up stack. So we've basically taken all the lessons that we've learned from building our first version and from running it on mainnet for over a year now. We're taking all the incredible abstractions. It turns out, by the way, that ETH2 and the merge, what the beacon chain does for Geth in the merge is exactly what L1 does for L2 Geths in rollups. Who would have thought? And so one of the incredible things is we can use the same APIs, the same clients, really, really crazy. And so Bedrock is our V1.0.0 that rolls up all these lessons into one thing. Another part of it is Cannon. Oh my God, Cannon, Cannon, Cannon. Cannon is the first public EVM equivalent fault proof. This means that our disputes and our rollups can behave exactly like the EVM itself. In fact, Cannon runs L1 blocks. It doesn't even run L2 blocks. And this is fascinating. It's a generalization of a lot of research that's gone into the rollup space over the past many years. And another thing that it does is it gets us ideal gas costs. So I could talk about this stuff all day, but we've got 8 minutes, so I'll keep going. I think the main thing that I'll say about it, though, is this came from our frustration with how we were doing rollups before. And what were we doing? We were starting by writing a fault proof, by writing the security system that kept our rollup secure, and then implementing a node that would follow the rules that this dispute game that we had invented followed. What we've realized is this is not the way to go, and this is what Cannon gives us. Before, we were trapped in a cage. We had to write a fault proof, and then take that exact logic we had implemented and rewrite it as a node. Now, we just write the node software, and the compiler turns that into fault proofs. Really, really, really powerful. Can't tell you how much of a relief it is to not write everything twice and be stressed that they don't match. It's really good. So we can compile the fault proof of an EVM chain. Okay, the last thing that's coming up in the actual near term is that we are getting fees much lower. Ethereum as a system is finally coming around to the fact that call data is the primary cost of the secure L2s today, and that we need to lower those. And we're starting to get pragmatic about these designs. We had EIP 4488, which might not have gone through, but at least was a discussion. We have dank sharding, one of the greatest names of Ethereum scaling I've ever heard in my life. It's literally dank sharding. Okay, no, it's donk sharding. It's because Donkrad came up with it, but so be it. And we also have these blob transactions that are going to really improve things in the short term. By the way, if that sounds interesting to you, our team is hacking together blob transaction stuff here at ETH Denver. So come find me if you want to contribute to the future of what Ethereum needs to be doing. All right, we got 6 minutes left. So for the last 6 minutes, I'll talk a little bit about what we see on the horizon. So I don't know how many of you guys have seen this, but Vitalik put out a post in the last month of last year called Endgame, which talks about his belief as to where the future of Ethereum scaling is going. Where does the rollup-centric roadmap end up? And I think there's a lot in there, and I couldn't possibly unpack it all now, but the main thing that I'll say is this diagram. If you take nothing away else from what Vitalik's talking about the future of Ethereum, take away this diagram. This is how Vitalik lays out 3 different scenarios that all lead to the same end state. Completely different approaches that appear to be narrowing in on the same thing. And the reality is that we're finally starting to see on the horizon what the end game for scaling looks like. What is that end game? That end game is one in which block production is centralized, validation is decentralized, censorship resistance is preserved, and we have huge blocks, which is really important because the blocks that we have today simply will not get us to the global scale. And for us to reach the next million people and the next billion people beyond that, what we have now just doesn't cut it. Okay, I showed the compile fault proof before thing with Cannon. What we're realizing is that if we can write a node and get a fault proof for it, we can write a sharded node and get a fault proof for a sharded chain. This is mind-blowing. This is what we're talking about. And it's one of the paths laid out here. It's the top right path, as a matter of fact. Okay, basically, how does that work? Quick TLDR. You have a huge block producer that can create really big blocks, and the block producer cuts that block up into 100 parts. And at each intermediate part along the way, it gives a hash of what the state is at that part. Then you take 1% of that block, you give it to 100 different computers, and those computers can run only 1% of the power, but check that if they line up all of their results, that the net result is what the sequencer gave, right? Okay. So if that doesn't make sense, or that diagram didn't make sense, just think of it like this. We're going to have big block producers that give us the Solana-like properties that we want, and we're going to have a bunch of people that can still run that on their laptops and contribute to security. This is a way to get decentralization, but still scale massively and composably in the way that we want. So remember before I said that the multi-chain, mono-chain slide was a bit of a false dichotomy? That's why. It's because we can have both. We can have big block producers, but we can have decentralized validation. And I think that is really powerful. And there are other ways that we can get there, but it seems that they're all ending up in this model. This is a ridiculous slide. We don't really know how to visualize this effectively yet, but I liked this way. OK, so TLDR, guys, that's just about it. I would say that the TLDRs, rollups have been exploding. It is not over yet. We've got EVM equivalent fault proofs that are really, really important. We're super glad to have them. We're going to have a pragmatic, non-3-year-away sharding roadmap that is going to give us the scalability that we need in terms of the cost of data. And in the long term, we're going to shard that data even more. We're going to shard the execution. And it seems like we are narrowing in on a vision for what blockchain scalability looks like into the future. So that's all I got, other than we are hiring. If you want to come jam with us and play more music and other songs together, come work with us, jobs.optimism.io. And as predicted, we have 2 minutes. So I could answer a question in the next 2 minutes, if you all like. Not answering that one. Yeah, going up. There's a mic right there. Yo. All right, we got a man with a question.
How with big block producers you want to keep censorship resistance and also, for instance, legal safety of these block producers? But censorship resistance is most important.
So the question was, how do we maintain censorship resistance and how do we keep safety? So for the safety, right, that's this thing, right? That's taking a bunch of laptops and splitting up the compute to keep every piece safe. For censorship resistance, it's by using L1, right? So just like we can take a rollup and send a censorship-resistant L1 transaction into the rollup, we can do that with these big rollups too. All right, it's 12:29. We got one more question to answer.
What's your guys' stance on the future ZK rollups and how that will compete with you guys and maybe what you guys would want to do that in the future?
What we're seeing with ZK rollups right now is very similar to what we were going through a year ago with that OVM. What we're realizing is that that EVM is fantastic. And it remains to be seen whether ZK will ever get as cheap as an optimistic system, because fundamentally you have to do this crazy moon math behind the scenes. Hopefully for many applications it is useful. And we definitely see that integrating into the larger picture of chains. But it's not going to be the only thing, because optimistic systems fundamentally are always going to be cheaper. Yeah. All right, guys, I think that's all the time I got. Thank you so much for jamming with me. Take care.